I just want to say, like I said to the group at lunch, for those of us who do this work day in and day out, to have you here has been just such an incredible inspiration and encouragement to me. Oftentimes when I'm talking in churches or with churches, I don't get this type of response. And to know that when you are cynical and become quite cynical of the church, and I am, that moments like this give me and us hope. So thank you. Yeah. I don't know if you all know this, but 38% of all girls and about 16% of boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18. Now, I want you to think about this with regard to numbers. With 75 million children in the United States, this translates to almost 15 million children who will be sexually victimized in the next 18 years. And if you take these numbers and you say, and I'm going to keep it simple because I'm terrible with math, that's why I became a lawyer. If you have a church of 100 men and 100 women, 20.5% of your congregation will be sexual assault survivors. If you had 20.5% of your congregation who lost a child in the last year, who had a home burned down within the last year, would your church be talking about it? Many of these survivors were abused by offenders who sit in pews, in the choirs, and who preach on Sunday mornings. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you have." Which of these 3 men do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." This afternoon, there's a very dark and desolate place in this world. It's a place found on the side of life's road where multitudes of hurting and traumatized souls lay dying and alone. A few still holding out hope that someone, anyone, will stop, while most others have simply lost hope at all. A side of the road where precious children wake up each day fearing that they will once again be victimized by an adult who they have been taught to trust and obey. An adult who is supposed to love and protect them. A side of the road where children live in fear of each night about what's going to happen when the lights go out. A side of the road where the lives and souls of children, men and women are destroyed by those in power who profess Jesus with their words while betraying and victimizing the vulnerable. A side of the road where the church ignores the painful cries of these victims while so oftentimes embracing the perpetrators as trusted leaders and model Christians. Yes, a side of the road where adult survivors of abuse are often marginalized and allowed to drown in their own hopelessness by the very church that is called to pursue them and to embrace them. A side of the road where the beautiful lives and souls of those made in the image of God are wounded, suffering, and dying. This dark and desolate place is also found inside of our churches, and many who I have encountered on the sides of the road throughout my life have often told me that this place is the church. A place that oftentimes defends the unborn, but all too often walks away from the born. A place that spends money and resources telling the world how much God loves children, all the while so many of its own children are being betrayed, ignored, and abused. A place that all too often shames and rebukes those who've been abused into a deathly silence as it walks by making pious excuses for not crossing the road to welcome and care for those who've been left alone to die. Yeah, a place that exploits power and authority to silence those who are crying out for help, hope, and justice. A place where we excitedly expend ourselves with ministries, Christian conferences, and various political causes, while ignoring and marginalizing suffering victims. And we do so, and we do acknowledge, and when we do, acknowledge their existence, we oftentimes simply exhort to them with our words, our actions, to simply forgive and move on. A place that claims to be the bride of Jesus, but tragically, so often, doesn't even know what Jesus looks like. I've met many of these amazing souls, these heroes. And I have the remarkable honor and privilege of calling many of them my friends. They've shared with me the horrors of being violated by those they trusted and the deep and indescribable pains of laying alone on the side of the road as they are ignored or shamed or blamed by family, friends, and the very faith community that so oftentimes eviscerated their bodies and their souls. I have little doubt that some of you sitting here know exactly what I'm talking about because you've lived through similar nightmares. See, I grew up thinking that the church is the place to reflect hope, joy, self-worth, peace, and life. In other words, a community that reflects Jesus. Instead, so often it has brutally robbed so many of those treasures. Listen to the words of those who've been robbed. One told me, because of my abuse on the mission field, I absolutely despise anybody who calls themselves a Christian. Another said, at age 13, I was so disillusioned with Christianity that I preferred to be in hell. I was committed to following Satan. I saw the native people worshiping the devil, and they were getting what they needed from their religion. One person emailed me this a few years ago, so I don't understand how he is so righteous and how everyone is standing strongly with him, to defend his ministry. They see him as under attack just because I finally spoke. He's righteous, and I'm tainted. They see me as evil. I'm scared mostly because I'm not always sure what is true. Does God see me that way too? Is God against me? Is he angry that I cannot forget? Is he angry that I haven't forgiven in some way that has allowed me to forget? I don't want to be broken anymore. Krista Brown, in her book, This Little Light, talks about a letter she received from a friend after Krista shared with her that she had been sexually abused by her youth pastor years earlier. And the friend was very sweet and said that she was hopeful that Krista would be restored if she just put her faith and trust in God. And so Krista says this in her book: most of the time I let such talk slide and don't say much, but the strength of this woman's sincerity made me realize she was deserving of a more serious response. Dear Susan, when I read your email, my hands shook so much that I spilled my coffee. My chest began to pound. I started being short of breath. I felt literally sick. I had to get up and take a walk with headphones to try to shift my brain into a different mode. That's what talk of God's love can do to me. It's a physiological response. I do not believe you intended to inflict any hurt on me, and so to the contrary, I expect that you intended to offer some comfort and hope. But from my perspective, it is as though your email brandished in front of me the very weapon that was used against me. It's as though you were telling me that I should pick up that very same sword that was once used to eviscerate me, and I should fall on it all over again. I can't do that. My love of God, my faith, my extraordinary desire to live the will of God, those are the very parts of me that were transformed into weapons that savaged and destroyed me. As a result, that part of my brain, that part of me that was once able to turn to God, to surrender to God, to pour my heart out to God, to put things in God's hands, to believe that God would take care of me, all that part of my brain is inaccessible. It is electrically charged, and it is in the land of the predator. It is a ravaged land that is there within my own head. I think it's somewhat analogous to a person who has a stroke. The person's brain tissue is damaged by the physical trauma of oxygen deprivation. And because of that trauma, part of their brain doesn't get the connections right anymore. It's as though it is short-circuited out. And depending on what part of the brain is affected, the result may be that they can't form words anymore, or even use them any longer. It's all the same bloody sword. It's the sword that I fell on when I was a church girl in Texas. That are the words of precious souls, of a precious soul who's been robbed, and been robbed by the church. The church cannot reflect the beauty and love of Jesus when we contribute to the horror and pain of abuse and then fail to repent and grieve over it. I grieve that much of the church is asleep and doesn't even realize it. I grieve that it's so hard to find Jesus in the midst of all of this. For too many precious souls inside the church is always winter, but never Christmas. Where is our Jesus in the midst of it all? See, as a follower of Jesus, I've struggled with how to understand and respond to this darkness and pain perpetrated by individuals and institutions that profess to love and follow him. How do I respond? How do we respond? How do we respond to all the beautiful individuals who've been so broken by those who profess to follow Jesus? How do we respond to abuse survivors who get up each day struggling with trauma, shame, self-worth, abandonment, and a lifetime of processing the horrors inflicted upon them? How do we respond when the vulnerable have been overwhelmed by the darkness and kicked to the sides of the road? How do we respond when the church is often the one doing the kicking? Interestingly enough, for me, the parable of the Good Samaritan is helping me process these painful questions with hope. I pray it may give you the same hope. It's all about the most unlikely of persons, a Samaritan, who first notices the hurting, moves towards them, gets down into the dirt with them, and brings them hope by lifting them up and carrying them to safety. It's about authentic compassion, a compassion fueled by empathy, whereby we are so moved and overwhelmed by the distress of another that their distress and pain becomes our very own. It's about a compassion that overrides all fear and risk and is propelled by an authentic and beautiful love. Time again, this story points me to God. Not the God of the self-righteous and self-important, nor the God of those who use his name to exploit and destroy the vulnerable in order to seize and protect power and control others, and not the God of those in the church who are so busy doing religious stuff that they don't even notice those who are laying on the sides of the roads. No, not that God. This parable points me to a much different God, a God who left the glories of heaven so he could meet us right here where we are, in the midst of our pain. A God who comforts the hurting who are drowning in despair because they are tired and they've given up hope. A God that won't allow these precious souls to drown. I'm getting to know this God. In fact, I love getting to know this God. Amidst all of my frustration, my anger, my cynicism, and tears. See, I'm getting to know the God who's not silent. God was not silent when confronted by evil, regardless of the consequence, even if it was death. It's the picture of the gospel. What does this mean for you and me? It means we can't be silent. We cannot be silent when confronted with the evil of abuse, regardless of where it happens, who commits it, or the consequences we may face when we confront it. Amen. It means that we must expose and confront abuse and those who abuse, regardless of their power, position, or influence. I'm tired of abusive Christian leaders who have gotten away with destroying lives, sometimes for decades, simply because of all the, quote, amazing work they did for God. Enough. It means that each of us is called to use our God-given voices and talents to protect the vulnerable, love and serve those who've been hurt, and to make them the church of tomorrow. Make the church of tomorrow the safest place for the suffering. Couldn't we love a church where the suffering and wounded are flocking to and not from? I'm getting to know a God who notices and pursues wounded people. God notices you. He notices me. But I love the fact that he does more than just notice us. He pursues us. That's the incarnation. God stepped into our world. Do we get that? This amazes me. I don't quite understand it, to be honest with you. But it's still amazing nonetheless. He pursues us and doesn't stop until we've been liberated by his embrace. So what does that mean for you and me? It means that God's incomprehensible love must be the fuel that propels you and me to pursue those around us who are suffering in silence after having their cries of pain questioned, marginalized, or simply ignored. Too many victims lying on the side of the road have never even been noticed, let alone pursued by the church. As a friend of mine puts it, the church must become a hospital for the broken and not a museum for good people. I'm getting to know a God who's a refuge for the weak and the wounded. Not only does he pursue us, but we find true safety in his embrace. It's that safety that makes him approachable by even the most unlikely of people, you and me. Don't we see this in the life of Jesus? Who were the people that were drawn to Jesus? Who felt the most safe with Jesus? The religious who had it all together? The powerful, the influential? Or the broken who realized they didn't have any of the answers? That's the story of the gospel. I love the fact that people came to hear Jesus. They came out to hear him. Why? Because there's something about him that they loved, they were drawn to. Too often today's church, and I'm guilty of it, we're propelling people away from us. They don't want to be within 1,000 feet of a Christian. It's not a reflection of Jesus. So what does this mean for us? It means that if we profess to love and follow Jesus, we must learn how to reflect his love by being safe and approachable by those who find themselves in their darkest and most helpless moments of life. Are we welcoming individually and corporately? Are we safe individually, corporately? Too many of our churches and Christian communities are not safe places for survivors of abuse. Many of them are forced into silence because they simply don't feel safe with those who are closest to them. I'm not sure about you, but all too often I find myself doing much more talking than listening. I think as Christians we have programmed ourselves to believe that we have to provide the hurting with answers, even when we don't have them. Believe it or not, listening is one of the most precious ways we can love and serve those who are struggling and who simply want to talk about it. They aren't looking for answers necessarily. They're simply looking for us to love and affirm them through listening. When we listen, we communicate that the one speaking is valued and loved. And oftentimes when we do talk, at least I can speak for myself, we don't empathize with the hurting soul who has approached us. Statements such as, "Why can't you forgive and move on?" are often no less traumatizing than the abuse itself. When we don't empathize with our words, we'll never be safe or approachable. When we don't empathize with our words, we don't reflect Jesus. And like I said, we don't have the answers. I shared at lunch that I oftentimes, in doing this work, I don't have the answers. I can talk about a God that loves. I can talk about Jesus that loves and feels pain and cares and pursues. But I don't have the answer for the person who asks, where was this Jesus when I was being sexually abused night after night by my stepfather? Where was this Jesus, Boz? Was he hiding in the closet? Was he watching? Was he getting his jollies too from watching? Tell me. I don't have an answer for that. And it makes me mad. And if I'm being honest, get a little mad at God. God can handle our anger, okay? And so I have to be honest and say, I don't know. I grieve and I'm angry with you, but I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. And that's sometimes the best we can do, but you know what? Don't minimize that. That's profoundly important. Presence, incarnation. I'm getting to know a God who treasures transparency and a healthy vulnerability. Isn't the gospel all about a God who did his most powerful work when Jesus was most transparent and most vulnerable on the cross? Not enough churches and Christian institutions understand this fundamental truth of the faith we proclaim. Time and time again, I've encountered faith communities that talk about a God who sacrificed himself in order to save the individual, and they speak that with their lips. All the while, they are sacrificing individuals while saving themselves. They live out the exact opposite of the gospel they preach, and oftentimes they don't even see it. No, the God I know, the God who's reflected in the person of Jesus, treasures transparency and healthy vulnerability. What does this mean for us? It means that we're free to be transparent and vulnerable with those who've lost hope. It frees us to weep with those who weep. As I mentioned earlier, to get angry alongside those who are angry. It even frees us to admit and acknowledge our own failures when we've not protected the vulnerable and welcomed and served the hurting. I'm so inspired when I hear a church go, "We blew it, period. Period." And we need to figure a way to demonstrate genuine repentance to the ones we've hurt. And we're going to do everything we can. We're going to expend ourselves into transforming the culture of this church so that never happens again. Those churches are there, and that's where the hope lies. But up to this point in time in my life, those are more the exception than the rule. I'm getting to know a God who doesn't let go. His love for each of us is eternal. He never lets me go. I love that about God. Even the days that I'm kicking and screaming and telling him to leave me alone, in his gentle way, he doesn't let me go. And he never lets you go either. This was demonstrated by his love for us on the cross. So what does this mean for us? One of the great tragedies of the church is that it's so often letting go, especially of those who are hurting the most. It's time for Christendom to say no more letting go. We must hold on, never letting go of those precious souls, regardless of the cost. And sometimes it's hard to hold on. I get that. Yes, the God that I'm getting to know treasures the rejected, the marginalized, and the ignored. He crosses the road and gets down into the dirt with the hurting and brutalized. The God I'm getting to know is so overwhelmed by the distress of others that their pain becomes his own. I'm getting to know the God of John 1, 4 through 5, who shines in the darkness, and who the darkness does not overcome. I can't tell you how many days that short verse has gotten me through the day. Henry Nouwen said this: though they do not deny the darkness, they choose not to live in it. They claim that the light that shines in the darkness can be trusted more than the darkness itself, and that a little bit of light can dispel a lot of darkness. They point each other to flashes of light here and there and remind each other that those flashes reveal the hidden but very real presence of God. The God that I'm getting to know is reflected in the flashes of light of so many I've come in contact with who spend their lives crossing roads and getting into the dirt with those who can't move and have given up hope. Whether you realize it or not, each time you cross the road, you are a flash of light in the darkness that is slowly being defeated. Such flashes of light are seen in the lives of so many amazing people, most who will never receive any attention or recognition, but who are simply stepping forward and refusing to be silent any longer about the horrors of abuse and our failure to serve the abused. Such flashes of light include the beautiful voices of those who are helping to empower those who've been abused and whose voices are either too weak or too exhausted to find their own voice, their own beautiful voice. Such flashes of light include my friend David, who spends his day finding qualified counselors for abuse victims who don't know where to turn and simply don't have the resources for getting help. Such flashes of light include my friend Jen, a woman who was sexually abused for years by her own brother, who's given her life to being a vocal advocate for abuse victims when she's not at work saving the lives of babies as a neonatal intensive nurse. Such flashes of light include Christy, who makes herself available 24/7 to those who've been abused and who are struggling and simply need somebody to listen with them, to cry with them, and as she reminds them, as she's speaking and listening, that they are loved. Such flashes of light include Robert, who has committed his life to protecting children and catching those who hurt them in the rural parts of West Virginia. Such flashes of light include my friend Lori, a sexual abuse survivor, whose beautiful words of encouragement have propelled me forward in some of my more difficult moments confronting this grave evil. Such flashes of light include my friend Peter, an amazing attorney who's committed his life to helping victims seek justice through the court system. Such flashes of light include Bonnie, a woman who was sexually abused as a child in the mission field and then raped as a young woman. Her life has been immeasurably traumatic and painful, and in many ways still is. Bonnie's become like a sister to me. She and her precious children are sobering, raw, and beautiful reminder to me of the ongoing struggles, pains, joys, and hopes of one who is spending a lifetime processing her trauma and the ugly reality that those who hurt her will never face justice on this earth. Such flashes of light include my friend Heidi. She's a pastor outside of Philadelphia, and she's also an abuse survivor who came into a church, a brand new church, with 85 people, mostly middle-aged, older folks, who a year earlier, one of those congregation members had been arrested for sexually abusing a child in one of the Sunday school classrooms during a church service. He had since been arrested and was no longer at the church. But she said, Boz, it's so odd. Nobody's talking about this. A child was raped in this church and nobody's talking about it. She says, I'm going to do a sermon series on abuse. And I said, wow, your first few weeks? She said, yeah. I said, well, that's brave. Good. She contacted me about 2 months later, 8 sermons later. And this is what she told me. She goes, Boz, there are 85 people in this church. Since I finished giving my sermon series, I've had 25 women from the ages of 55 to 85 come to me and share with me that they were survivors of either child sexual abuse or adult sexual assault. And half of them, I'm the very first person they've ever told. That, my friends, is a flash of light. I have little doubt that there are many amazing flashes of light sitting in this room, and I am looking at some of them right now who I know. And in rooms all over this country and world. You may not know it yet, but God is up to something. And it's something really, really good. I realize that this can be a long, dark, and often lonely journey. On those days that I simply want to quit, I'm reminded that I'm not alone on this journey. In fact, I walk alongside some of the most amazing heroes on the face of this earth. Heroes who are always crossing the road to help lift me up and who inspire me to press forward to another day. Recently, on one of those days when I felt that I simply couldn't go on, I received this precious note from one of these heroes that simply said this: thank you from all of us who have languished by the road, bloody, beaten, and robbed, and watched the Levites and the Pharisees just walk on by. These heroes are on the journey. These heroes on this journey are the flashes of light in my life that do reveal the hidden but very beautiful presence of Jesus, who deeply cares and who never gives up. Aslan is on the move. That means nothing is safe. But rest assured, that is good news. As stated best by Mr. Beaver in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when describing Aslan, he said, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Such a God gives me incredible hope that one day light will indeed overcome darkness, and there will be no more abuse, our children will be safe, and those who have been abused will experience the unconditional love from Christians all over the world. They will experience Jesus. Such a God gives us hope that perhaps winter is coming to an end inside of the church, and that spring is on its way. Until that day, I encourage each of us in this room to spend the rest of your lives looking for roads to cross and the wounded to love as you carry out the work of our good, good King. Thank you.